Welcome to this keynote talk. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Tiziana Ferrari, who's the director of the EGI Foundation. The EGI Foundation, of course, you'll tell us more about this, I suppose, right? But it's a very central institution that's very of core importance to the European Open Science Cloud, as it turns out. And I suppose some of you might have heard of it, but this is part of the European set of infrastructures and initiatives that we hope can actually take scientific research a bit more forward by making use of technology primarily, right? So thank you very much.
So thanks for being here. It's always difficult to be in between the last part of the meeting and relaxing and having a dinner together. But I'm really thrilled to be here today. I think schools are the best place where people can speak and talk about science. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. And I hope that with this presentation, I will be able to inspire you, bringing information and also awareness on how science in different domains, not just climate modeling, which was the focus of the school today, is being conducted internationally. You are very young students or scientists, and I think you have a great challenge ahead of you. If you will continue with science and research, you will have really the difficulty of being able to keep up with your science and the latest technologies, which are disrupting science in many ways. And I wish you all the best in this your career and journey. And I hope with this presentation, you will see how your previous generations have been dealing with data-intensive science and making IT infrastructures available for the science you're doing today. So yes, I am the director of the EGI Foundation, but I'm also a scientist by training. I studied broadband communications at the University of Bologna. I've heard Italian being spoken by some of you. I then moved to the Italian National Institute for Nuclear Physics, where I've focused on prototyping and testing the Italian infrastructure for universities and research, and this is bringing us back to 1995, where international connectivity, if you can imagine this, for science was in the scope of 500 kilobit per second to 1 megabit per second. So what science could deliver thanks to networking was really very, very hampered by the ability to transfer bits across the globe. So that's where I started focusing on broadband communications and science. And then I was lucky enough to focus on broadband connectivity and computing for the new generation of experiments in high energy physics at CERN. And this is where I started dealing with advanced IT applied to very demanding computational cases. And with this presentation, I hope I can bring you some of the things which, as I said, in the last 20 years were laid down to make today's science possible, and also give you insights on how science is moving ahead of us in the coming 10 to 20 years to give new tools, new data, and new ways of conducting science to all of you who will be scientists in the 20 years to come. I will be retired probably by then. So in this presentation, we will talk a bit about open infrastructures, and everything we speak here is about infrastructures for science. And then I will bring you my experience of the importance of scientific software as a fundamental component of infrastructures, and then the importance of open data. And I think Christian at the very beginning of today gave already an excellent example of how modeling data and the sharing of this data is really fundamental in order to enable this kind of science for all of you. And we will see open data and how it's moving forward also thanks to our politicians at the European Commission and their strategies. So I hope I don't disappoint you in this presentation. It won't be just a technical set of slides, but also giving you some ideas on how policymakers are planning your future as a scientist. So let's look at open infrastructures, and I bring here the experience of the EGI Federation, which I have the honor and the responsibility to lead as a director at the EGI Foundation in Amsterdam. And this is one of the many examples of European infrastructures. There are quite a few of these infrastructures for broadband connectivity, which is GEAN, infrastructures for data distribution, UDAT, infrastructures for open science, open air, which is actually led here in Athens, but also research infrastructures, which are big networks of scientific institutes which come together to harmonize the research data they collect nationally to make it available internationally. So I have to say Europe is very well organized and has extremely well structured the research communities which can rely on solid foundations. You may wonder what federation means exactly, and I like to give you a very concrete explanation. The budget for science in every single country in the European Commission is clearly very much dependent on our national economies. And if you compare the economy, for example, of Italy or Germany, France, any country in Europe, the economy of these countries is really a dwarf compared to the United States, China, India, and other giants worldwide. This means that if Europeans want to do fine research and achieve excellence, they have no choice but working together as European scientists, joining their projects as European scientists, and also sharing funding to make the data and all the infrastructures necessary accessible for their peers in other countries. So federation means, very simply put, bringing funding and infrastructures and data which is gathered and invested nationally and make it available at European level and beyond for all your peer scientists. Without this ability to share across countries, every country would really be very limited in what it can achieve scientifically. So most of the big European scientific collaborations, in fact, exist because of this European dimension. And in EGI, we focus on computing. So our mission is in particular supporting big scientific collaborations. Big means having a very large spread worldwide that needed to process very large amounts of data. And I think, again, ENES is really a very good example, but we have many of these good examples in Europe, and I will tell a few stories about them in a moment. So in the last 20 years, European countries have been successful in building what we call a hyperscale facility. Hyperscale can be compared to a Google Cloud or Amazon services or Alibaba services. Hyperscale means a very large infrastructure, which is possible thanks to national funding and the ability to use this infrastructure by opening it also to other scientists beyond your research center and country. So in order to hamper this problem of limited funding, European scientists can now rely on large infrastructures that bring these investments and data centers available for them to compute their data. And this map shows the footprint of the EGI Federation. And you can see, of course, there is a larger concentration of data centers in Europe, but we have quite a few data centers also in Africa, many of these Asia Pacific and Latin America. And typically access to these data centers is open to scientific projects which are relevant to these countries and research institutes. I want to say a word because we are facing this year an unusual and traumatic situation of having a war in Europe. And I want to give you with this example an example of how science can go beyond geopolitical challenges and have a word for science in Ukraine and Russia in the EGI Federation. Ukrainian scientists and Russian scientists have a very close collaborations in many scientific domains, and those which are more common in EGI are physics. In EGI, we have data centers from Russia, from the Russian Federation, but also from Ukraine. And access to these data centers is open to any scientist that belongs to the same collaboration. And this means that we have scientists from Ukraine and from Russia that in fact work in the same scientific project. And they had the same ambition in their life to have discoveries and to work together. So this is, I think, a very nice example of how open science can bridge citizens, can bridge scientists across the borders. Ukrainian data centers in the last 6 months have been disconnected from our federation. Unfortunately, a few of these have been destroyed because of military actions. Others have been, in fact, switched off because of problems with electrical supply. Because we are a federation, we are now planning to allocate capacity in the data centers which are from other countries and other continents to make part of this capacity available to our Ukrainian scientists that can't use their data centers nationally. And I think this is, an amazing example of how science can really be open and rely on open infrastructures, not only to achieve excellence, but also to be there to support the science when this is required. I want to say a few words about how these infrastructures are possible. First of all, they bring scientific data together, and I will give you a few examples. They federate facilities, so data centers that are already available and provide the storage and computing resources, but also broadband connectivity, which allows a very fast exchange of data between different data centers, even the possibility to mirror data and compute and process your data in different data centers in different locations in the world, but also have higher level services which allow scientists to get authenticated with your university credentials and have access to data storage and computing facilities which are hosted and funded by institutes which are beyond your university. All of this is possible, and we have already achieved amazing results in science. And I like to give credits to the discovery of the Higgs boson, and those who are not in physics may wonder how all these discoveries were possible thanks to the data taking at CERN. In this experiment, there are 4 important detectors and a huge amount of data which is amassed daily by these detectors. This data is a digital data which needs to be stored, has to be reduced because a lot of this is irrelevant for science, and only part of the data is then used for analysis and for extracting scientific knowledge. This amount of data is so large that CERN cannot store the data, and we have been using the EGI Federation to distribute and replicate this data across 10 different countries in all these continents that you saw before. And scientists from these international collaborations, which typically embrace hundreds of countries, can use the data hosted in Fermilab in the United States, but also at CERN, at CNAF in Italy, KIT in Germany, and CNRS in France, and many other data centers without having to pay for the access to the data and the computing which is necessary to process this data. And more recently, you may have heard about the discovery of the gravitational waves, which was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2017. Einstein, in his relativity theory, predicted the existence of gravitational waves, and this was published as a scientific hypothesis back in, 1917. And exactly 100 years after his publication, there was the first experimental evidence of a collision of the 2 stars. And that was thanks to data taking in the United States and also data taking in PISA, where the European Observatory for Gravitational Waves is based. How did the scientists achieve this discovery? The data taken in the United States, they have 3 observatories in 3 different locations in the US, was compared and analyzed with different models. So Americans have their own modeling tools and they have their own science behind. Europeans have their own data collected in PISA, they have their own prediction, simulation, and analysis tools. And with different approaches to the science, then they compare the results and they check if their results are comparable scientifically. Only after this comparison and validation of the quality of the observation, then there is a publication. And in fact, the publication was awarded to a collaboration, which is Virgo and LIGO, which is a European collaboration and an American collaboration together. And why so? Because they shared the data, they together checked the accuracy of the event, and they published together. It's an amazing achievement if you think about it, because these observatories to be implemented require billions of investments, billion from the United States, from Europe. And obviously you want to be always the first scientific collaboration publishing and being awarded the next big grant for your science, for your university. So scientists are competitors in achieving and being the first in discoveries. But when you have a big science of this kind, you can only do this if you join forces. So this is another, I think, amazing result of open science, thanks to the sharing of data across competing scientific teams. Today, the EGI infrastructure is multidisciplinary, so we support physics, which is the biggest user community in terms of amount of computing consumed, but actually health is the largest user base. And I will tell you in a moment how, for example, structural biology does modeling on larger scale infrastructures. Today we serve 78,000 users. Most of these are, in fact, from larger scientific collaborations. We have about 150 international projects. And collectively, the data, which is independently stored and managed by these scientific collaborations, amounts to about 1.3 exabytes. So you can imagine how expensive and demanding in terms of physical resources and human resources is to have all this research data available and federated. We spoke about infrastructure, communications, computing, but what about software? And I think you had exercises in the afternoon. I was hearing your working groups talking about analytics. So this is, I think, focusing on that part of infrastructure. And I'd like to give you an example, which is one of the success stories of the EGI Federation, which is structural biology. So in structural biology, a lot of, for example, new drugs are discovered by simulating how the change in structure of molecules is affecting their behavior. So they make a lot of use of simulation tools. And these simulation tools are typically developed by universities or groups of scientists. Thanks to these achievements, we make their scientific software available as a service, which means a scientist from structural biology that wants to use the simulation tool developed by their counterparts at Utrecht University doesn't need to spend 2 years of their PhD to develop the same tools. They will use the tools that the other scientists have developed and apply those tools to their own data. The problem is that scientists are not paid to provide the software as a service and not even to provide access to millions or thousands of scientists. So what do we do in EGI? Because we want to open these tools to any scientist in the world, these analytics tools are using in their backend this data center federation, which means they can access computing centers from the US, from Asia, and from Europe, regardless of their country and affiliation in terms of research institute. And this geomap shows how these scientific applications have been used so far in AGI. They have, these applications, more than 30,000 registered users. And the biggest users are, you see, from India, from the United States, and from China, not from Europe, amazingly so. But it doesn't matter. Why so? Because United States offers capacity to process and use these applications. And this is thanks to the Federation. And these tools were extremely instrumental during the COVID pandemic to simulate, for example, already approved drugs and to simulate how these approved drugs, by combining them, would improve the prognosis of extreme COVID cases. So this was, I think, another example where we are not talking about Nobel Prizes, but a real, very concrete contribution to society. I'd like to say a few words about architecture, how we do this in AGI. So we typically pool data centers worldwide. We have a federation services, which are software solutions, which create the glue on top of the data centers. They allow shipping of processing jobs in all the data centers by creating an homogeneous layer. They create an homogeneous layer for data access and discoverability, which means data in the US will be discoverable by scientists through their application, even though the application is running in a European data center. And then we have a number of these thematic data spaces. So these are analytics provided by scientists to be used by other scientists. So the value of this infrastructure is not the amount of computing which comes together, but in the applications that the scientists can build on top of that. This is a fairly detailed example of this architecture applied to clouds. So EGI today operates the largest research cloud federation in Europe. We have about 30 different cloud providers. They're all based, on OpenStack, and we use OpenStack components to create this glue to essentially allow them to use any cloud facility without having to deal with the problem of choosing and adapting their application to that. And today in this infrastructure, we have China, but also South Africa, and we hope to expand this beyond. Once big collaborations like the Square Kilometre Array, which is a big observatory in radio astronomy being implemented in South Africa and Australia, will be in operations. This will be, of course, a big boost to increase the capacity, but also other big international experiments, which are today only in the design phase. We are today expanding the infrastructure also to include HPC, and HPC is a key component or type of computing that is quite useful in applications which are hybrid, which can use clusters for low parallelism, but also need HPC for parts of their processing workflow. And integrating HPC with other kinds of computing architectures can be quite challenging, as many HPC systems require tailoring of the applications, but there are also in Europe policy problems in how scientists can access HPC systems or research data centers. So in expanding this federation towards HPC, we are dealing with both the technical problems, but also policy access problems. This is for us a target of development for the coming 5 years. And I'm now moving to the last part of my overview. And we spoke about infrastructures, so facilities, computing, storage. We spoke about software. And this last slide is about scientific data. European Commission, our politicians in Brussels, a few years ago launched a new initiative, which is quite ambitious. It's called European Open Science Cloud, and has the ambition of bringing research data, which is typically still stored in isolation by research institutes or research groups, and facilitate and promote the sharing of this data. We know very well scientists are reluctant on sharing their data because this is a key asset for their publications. And in open science, the principle is If you have the data, your data will be publishable together with your article, but also with the software you've used and the pipelines that show how you conducted your computing and analysis. And all of that is part of your scientific work. So we're moving from an era where science was rewarded thanks to citations and only papers count, in an era where actually citations of research data, reuse of data generated by other groups and their software is also integrally part. And that means the scientists, we hope in the coming future, will be not just rewarded for the papers, but also for the amount of data that is shared. This is a bit the vision, which requires a lot of policy changes and also how scientific institutes reward their scientists in the work they conduct. So it's a fairly ambitious objective, which is not requiring changes in how this research data is shared and found, but also in how scientists get rewarded for their discoveries. The ambition of the Commission is to create a European single market for data. This is a bit of a marketing term, let me say this, but what this means for scientists, or at least the vision, is that the research data that will be produced by your peer colleagues will be discoverable, accessible, and you will be able to reuse such data. One of the biggest challenges, like in climate modeling, but also other sciences, which use a large amount of data, is that this data cannot be easily downloaded. And downloading some data sets may require, once you have access, may require even weeks. It depends on the size of the data set. But if you go into the terabyte scale, if not bigger, it could be even unfeasible to retrieve the data and find in your lab the space where this data can be processed. So the big problem is when you go into this large scale amount of data, how can a scientist in fact use the data? There will be silos. It will be very hard for scientists to make a scalable access to this data if you don't have other enablers which make this possible. And the idea is that computing has to go next to the data. Data has to be open with the computing resources. So a scientist that needs data which is stored at the DKRZ, let me make an example which is applicable in this school, should be able also to process such data if the data is not small enough to be downloaded effectively. And this means, of course, also opening questions about funding. Who is going to pay for the computing infrastructure that a given scientist is used but is not affiliated to the KRZ? It's not a trivial question, because when you do a lot of computing, this means huge investments, and there is an economy to build behind that, which is completely new. We don't have a research data economy. So who pays for the research data once the data is open? This is a bigger question the Commission wants to address. And now I'm moving beyond research, and I'm going into a bigger strategy of the European Commission, which is the data strategy for Europe, also for industry and policymakers. The ambition is that this open market of data will be also possible for industries and for policymakers that want to share data. And the policy making, especially in climate handling, is clearly very important. So there is a large initiative and a lot of research being funded by the Commission to enable these data spaces to come to an existence. And this is a diagram, very, very high level, which shows some of the first works. This is an open day project outcome, which shows how these data spaces are being architected. So they will need, of course, networking, outdoor facilities, but they will need mechanisms for identity management, data transmission, data analytics on top of the data, encryption if you have secure data, anonymization if you have data that should be stripped off of the identity of the patients, for example. So anonymization is very important in many disciplines, such as social sciences and humanities that want to use data from citizens. or for example, in cancer research, where you want to have access to images, x-rays, but you don't want to know the identity of the patient. So there is a lot of enabling services that need to be mobilized. And next to these, also services which will allow accounting, so to measure who is using what, but also security policies, how you ensure all of these comes together in a way which is against the misuse of data and misuse of the public infrastructures and so forth. So what are the industrial and the sectors that the Commission is prioritizing? Health and cancer research is one of the priorities of our Commission. Energy, agriculture, the Green Deal, which is the big policy of the Commission to treat climate change, mobility, so mobility in cities, finance, and there are a few others spaces not mentioned here, but it's a very broad spectrum. And for each sector, there will be funding opportunities to enable key stakeholders to achieve this vision. I like to go from this very high level policy and vision into a concrete example. So we have heard about ENES, how science is done, how data is federated. Is this a data space? How does ENES relate to this high level policy? I think that this couple of last slides, don't be afraid, I'm reaching the end of my presentation. I hope they bring all of what we have heard before, infrastructure, data, and software, into a cohesive picture that I think you have probably used or experimented today and in the coming days at the school. So the high-level draft model of the data space for ENES will be, first of all, based on community databases, which are distributed, as Christian well explained already, worldwide. And this is the power of sharing climate models in ENES. So the data holdings have to be shared. And in order to do that, you need transfer tools to move the data across data centers in the Federation. You will need also mechanisms to cache the data. If you have data which cannot be processed where the data is stored, the data has to be mirrored and moved into another node of the Federation. And then you will need applications on top of that and the ability to process the data. So you will need, for example, a federated infrastructure, which brings HPC, quite central, obviously, in ENES, but also other computing facilities which will be suitable. You will need mechanisms like Kubernetes to execute your workflow through containers in different cloud providers. And on top of these, you can build applications. And for example, you can use a Jupyter Hub and integrate your data analytics with this massive infrastructure, which is hidden to you as a scientist, because all the data management and the computing is transparent to the scientist. One way of doing this, and this is for experienced users, will be to enable SSH Access, which bridges OpenID Connect, which means you don't need to have your own credentials created in the HPC center, but you can use your own institutional credentials to be translated into local tokens. This is a big transition that we are implementing these years in how users are authenticated and authorized. Unfortunately, there is no time today to go into the technicalities, but it's essentially implying that, like you say today, you can use your Google account to be authenticated on your Ryanair platform. Similarly, with your user identity, you can be authenticated when accessing HPC node, or you want to transfer or access data. It's the same analogy, just applied to your daily work. And another way will be, of course, to have a customizable Jupyter node through Jupyter Hub, having nodes which can be deployed and offered as a service. And this would be a simpler way of doing this, because scientists don't need to arrange all the instantiation of their applications in the infrastructure. So with this, I've reached my final slide, and my concluding message for you is that science is already to a great degree open. And in the last 20 years, there were massive improvements, which makes this vision today possible. The improvements were in the 90s, the big increase in capacity and I would say reliability of networks, which today we give for granted. They're not granted at all. This means a lot of investment at European level by your universities and research centers. The next big game changer was moving from a centralized computing approach. Many old scientists were used to have their servers, central server in their machine room, to a fully distributed mechanism. And the first and biggest experiment that tried this is, I've mentioned them, the high energy physics experiments and so on. They were the ones that thought about this vision, about this possibility. They made a bet that networking would become so affordable that they could move megabytes, gigabytes, exabytes of data reliably. And based on this very big technological assumption, they completely changed the way they do computing. And today, now, this is mainstream in more and more big scientific collaborations. And now the third pillar, the data. I think we are just at the beginning of opening data. So we're just scratching the surface. A lot of the problems like mirroring effectively data, discovering of data with compatible vocabularies. I think Christian gave an excellent example of how important metadata is. We're just at the beginning of this journey. And my big wish for all of you who maybe will continue as a scientist in the future is that when you will be 50, in your 50s like I am, you can also teach this to your students and say, we have achieved finally sharing of research data in the last 20 years. So wish you bigger success in your career, and I hope many of you will keep committed to science, because it's great to benefit society with your work. Thank you. I hope it was not too tiring. Do you have any question, any curiosity? You should not be shy. Then it was very, very clear, so I'm very happy with that. Oh, there is one, yes. Okay, the question is how you make sure, I hope I understand correctly, how you ensure that your data is properly used and shared. There are policy issues, of course. So when you have data, but also computing infrastructure to be shared, you cannot open this to anyone. Because there are security concerns, data can be protected and may not be available to everyone. You have to apply to access the data, like, for example, clinical data. Not everyone can use this clinical data. So the infrastructure has to have services which enable only selected scientists to access a computing infrastructure and application of the data. And this is now a solved problem. How is this done in science? A scientific collaboration is modeled, we call it virtual organization. It's typically an experiment, can include tens, hundreds of thousands of scientists. And these are classified by the kind of group, research group they participate in. They can be multiple research groups. What is the research institute they come from? And once you have this information, like the project you work on, who is your research institute, what is your authorization level? You may be a scientist with the right to delete data. Other scientists may only have the right to have a preview of the data or to download the data. You can access, you can really manage the access at the level of each single user and its own attributes. So it's like having the scientist with an identity card, and the identity card has a number of attributes which say, I'm working for this experiment, I have these authorization roles, and thanks to this metadata, which is attached to your credentials, then the data provider will allow you to execute some operations or not. And typically it's the collaboration manager, so the PI of a project, which decides what is the right role for specific scientists. So this authorization is done by groups, and the choice of who is allowed to do what is in the hands of our project PI. Another question?
I was just wondering that in the topic that we're looking most at, like data science, from here, usually the greatest advances are done by private companies. And I'm just wondering if, like, I don't know, Google or whatever, and finding the newest, best algorithms. And I'm wondering if with this, you're thinking that the open research community might even get to compete with that, or if the resources provided are still very different?
It's a very nice question. So the gist of your question is there a competition between what commercial cloud providers are delivering and what scientists are delivering? There is an increasing maturity in what commercial providers can deliver in terms of capacity and adding on value. And this question has a couple of dimensions. So I can give you what we are planning to do as EGI Federation and what is also the plan of our politicians at European level. Recognizing that some of the services are becoming commodity means that in order to deliver science, you can rely on this commodity service and focus your funding on adding value services which only scientists can in fact deliver for their peers. So part of this infrastructure that today I've shown is primarily publicly funded by ministries should in the near future become a hybrid infrastructure which integrates also cloud providers and other providers of software and enhancing capabilities. And the funding should go really into what is specific to science, which typically is not commercially appealing, because commercial providers want to make money in the end, while scientists want to have research done. So the funding should move more and more into what is being developed and uniquely developed by scientists, because they are the only ones with the knowledge. And this is why these scientific applications I showed in my slide, if you remember, with the hierarchy, are becoming more and more central in our strategy. There is, from a political point of view, also an interest in Europe to boost economic growth, which means opening and removing barriers between science and the private sector. And there are a lot of ways to do this. Digital innovation hubs, they were mentioned by the first introduction, Democritus as one, which allow essentially technology transfer between industry and research, public research. There are a lot of collaborations that are being put in place to ensure the maximum synergy. And some of these services that I was showing, for example, structural biology, these molecular simulation tools are even used in pharma. Quite often not on our infrastructure because they have, of course, the trade secrets, but they use the same tools in their own labs to do simulation, which means they are using components of software coming from science to deliver commercial products. So the exchanges are bilateral. It's not just about commercial entities becoming more and more relevant, but also enabling adding value solutions developed in science to be deployed by the private sector. Thank you. Thanks for the question. It was a really nice one. Thank you for being here.